Hello and welcome to the Resistance podcast. Today I'm joined by Peter Ford. Peter is Deputy Leader of the Workers' Party. He's a freedom activist. And will you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Well, I'm a former career diplomat. I guess that's my main claim to fame. I was British ambassador in Bahrain and Syria. After a long 30-odd year career with the Foreign Office, I trained as an Arabist. And after diplomacy, I joined the United Nations and worked part of the time in Gaza, as it happens, for the UN agency that deals with Palestine refugees, UNRWA. We can perhaps come back to that because they're in the firing line at the moment. But I was proud to work for that UN agency for 8 years before I retired from paid work. But after that, I've lived a life of campaigning, was radicalized during the COVID wars, and for the last 12 months have been active in George Galloway's Workers' Party.
And you're George Galloway's deputy?
One of three deputies, yes. Chris Williamson, former MP, is another deputy, and Andy Hudd, a trade unionist, is the third.
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about the success that you guys have just had and in Rochdale. So you've gone in there, and I've got to say, it can only really be George Galloway who does this, because he comes in, he gets kicked out, he makes a new party, he comes back in, and he manages to defeat all of the main parties, the Unit Party. Do you want to talk a little bit about the absolute success that you had in Rochdale?
Yeah, well, George Galloway is a phenomenon. George is unique. I just wish we could clone him, and then we would go into the general election and wipe the floor with them all. George has won 3 or 4 by-elections, often from a standing start with a new party. He did have a long career as an MP within the Labour Party, but he was always a rebel. And he has a unique style and charisma in British politics. This is, I think, the secret of his success. He speaks to people in language that they can understand. He's a fantastic orator. He's self-taught. He knows how to use language, but above all, he's a conviction politician. This makes him pretty unique in modern British politics. He really, really believes in the causes that he supports, and he's been supporting Palestine for many, many years. Some have tried to accuse him of being an opportunist, a carpetbagger, but his track records show that not only has he supported Palestine from within the Labour Party, but he has made personal sacrifices on issues of principle concerning the Middle East. He left the Labour Party over the war on Iraq. He's no opportunist.
He's one of very few who actually took that stance at the time.
Absolutely. He took a big hit career-wise, financially, personal reputation, but he's proven that a good man can come back, can resonate with the public, and George is such a fantastic communicator. He's in a way a bit like Donald Trump, and George is one of the few British politicians who don't suffer from Trump derangement syndrome, who don't freak out at the mention of the Donald. In fact, in the aftermath of the Rochdale victory, George said smilingly, what we want now is to make Rochdale great again. Channeling the Donald. And that's the other thing about George. He's almost unique in using humor. Often it's an edgy, ironic humor, and he puts mainstream media correspondents on their mettle. In fact, on their defensive. He's one of the few politicians in this country who force the media to respect them.
Well, I've seen that clip with Sky News.
There are people that listen to what you say about whether or not Israel has a right to exist, what you say about what many Jewish people think are threatening slogans.
We had this conversation last night. Why are you reheating it?
Because in the light of the Prime Minister's
Don't keep
statement.
telling me about the Prime Minister as if he was Moses.
Do you not respect the Prime Minister?
Do I respect the Prime Minister? I despise the Prime Minister. And guess what? Millions and millions and millions of people in this country despise the Prime Minister. I don't respect the Prime Minister at all.
That was an amazing clip.
Epic. He rocked Sky News back on their heels. The mainstream media, it's a long story, but we all know that the mainstream media have their narratives. They don't like the narrative to be countermanded, and therefore they can't cope with someone like George, who won't play by their rules, who won't be defensive, who won't be put on the back foot.
He always goes on the attack.
George,
it's almost like Teflon. Nothing sticks to him because
exactly.
he's happy to make a joke of himself sometimes.
Exactly. George believes strongly that attack is the best form of defense, especially when you're dealing with mainstream media who are always trying to put you on the back foot.
Do you think that we need more of that from politicians, people with a sense of humour? Because it feels to most people like most politicians have no sense of humour and they don't really have a sort of humanity. A lot of people say they're all sociopaths or they're all psychopaths. And it seems to a lot of people, I'd say, that having a politician with humour is an indication, okay, maybe they've got a soul.
Exactly. I mean, look at Starmer. He's just a stuffed suit. Another manager in a suit. Absolutely no sense of humour. So, as one example of George's humour, he described Starmer as being so wooden that he thought he saw a bird nesting in him the other day. I mean, that just encapsulates both.
Well, the man he does seem quite soulless. I wanted to ask, what was the secret to your success in Rochdale? Because you came first. It was an independent who came second. Was it the Tories in third?
Yeah.
And was Labour in fourth or fifth place?
The official Labour candidate was fourth. The secret of the success was, I think, threefold. First of all, the Gaza crisis. George himself recognised that the key to his success was the strong feelings, particularly in areas with big Muslim populations, like Rochdale, strong feelings, and he dedicated his success to the people of Gaza. Secondly, it was down to the personality of George himself, the right man at the right time coming forward. And thirdly, it was the way George put the others on the back foot. So Labour were forced to officially disown their official candidate after he said something that was deemed unseemly about Israel, Israel having known about the 7 October before it happened. But
which is possible.
This was a forced error. They only disowned him because they were facing George Galloway, and the Gaza issue had risen to prominence. So it was I think the fact that George was competing already very strongly, and indeed the bookies were still, you could still get 6-1 even after on Galloway winning. You know, you'd have to put a pound down, you get 6 back, because they still thought that George was going to lose even after Labour had withdrawn officially their candidate. And at the start, you could have got 25-1. I kick myself I didn't
Oh, you didn't?
get round to it.
No, did you
but
at least go when it was 6-1?
I know a journalist, a well-known, used to be pro-conservative journalist, who had a couple of hundred on him early on. Yeah.
Well, he made a pretty penny. Right, I'm going to rely on you for my political betting.
Well, I think there's only one rule with political betting: never believe the experts. That was the lesson of Rochdale. You use your own nous. At the end of the day, bookies will set odds according to how the money is going. Their goal is not to predict the winner, but to maximize their gains or minimize their losses. Yeah.
So, you had this great success. Do you think it relied on hatred of the Uniparty as well? Just a complete scorn for the establishment?
Yes, I simplified when I said there were only three factors. I'm overlooking the very important fact that George appeals expressly to the working class vote, and working class people being oppressed by the Uniparty, the con labs, the lab cons, conservative or conservative light, the indistinguishable two mainstream parties. And what we've just seen in the last week with a right-wing Tory MP crossing over to Labour really says all you need to know on that subject. There is no difference, or as George puts it, they're both they're two cheeks of the same backside.
I saw that and I thought that was good. So you might say you're an anti-war party. You might say you might even be the anti-war party or the main anti-war party. How is it you aim to achieve peace and stop the war that's going on in Palestine?
We're a ginger group. We're obviously not going to be the government anytime soon. But we're helping to mobilize public opinion in this country and worldwide. George's victory, I'm sure, was one of the things that helped the movement on the campuses in America to crystallize. It was noticed. Until about February, the American campuses had been quiet. But George helped to kick off an international revolt against the uniparties everywhere, Britain or America.
And Biden has now pulled back part of their invasion because they were building a pier. They were going to send armed forces down there with guns who would obviously get fired back. It's, a lot of people describe this as an American invasion. Biden's now pulled that back, and apparently they're now building a pier in Israel instead. So you think George has contributed towards that?
George has helped to create a climate of opinion in which the imperialists, the pro-Israeli parties are on the back foot and they hate it. They're not used to it. They're used to having a monopoly of the narrative. Now that narrative is being changed on many levels, especially on the level of public opinion in the United States. Biden is desperate now to shore up his crumbling vote among young Democrat voters. This planned artificial port that you mentioned, I always saw it as a Trojan horse. Nothing the Americans would do to help the Palestinians could possibly be sincere. There was always an agenda. But speaking of Biden and America, I call it not land of the free, but land of the fee. And talking of fees, Biden, I saw just yesterday, has received $11 million over the years from AIPAC and other groups in America supporting Israel. So not land of the free, land of the fee. And Biden's fee so far has been $11 million.
Well, you see that in the Labour Party as well, because a lot of the big donors in the Labour Party are Zionists. So Do you think that's why Keir Starmer is following along with their agenda, because he wants that support and that money, and they're essentially they're just purging people right now from the Labour Party, aren't they?
It's always risky to attribute motives to people, even yourself. I mean, how often have I not had a row with my missus and the next day asked myself, was that really about tidiness in the house, or was it something deeper? You don't even know, especially at the time, your own motives. So how can you know somebody else's? I think it's possible that the money factor contributions have been part of the picture for why Labour are so pro-Israeli now. But I think more important has been electoral calculation. They saw how Corbyn was murdered by demonization for his support for Palestine. They got him on trumped-up anti-Semitism charges, and therefore Starmer's calculation from the beginning has been to put distance between himself and Corbyn to show that he is the anti-Corbyn.
Yeah, because otherwise you've got a lot of Zionists in the mainstream media, and they can hang you.
He's had to go to the opposite extreme to bring the perceptions down to the way they were before Corbyn.
Well, I see. I find it strange that people go after Jeremy Corbyn for this, the anti-Semitism thing, because I think, as much as I disagree with Jeremy Corbyn on a lot of things, I don't think that can really be levelled against him at all. And I just find it weird that people are using that to attack. But then again, it seems just like it's disingenuous people using this because it's easy, because it's an easy route of attack to go, oh, well, he's pushing this anti-Semitic line. By the way, can I question you on this anti-Semitic thing? Because the concept of a Semitic race, if you go over to the United States, this is considered a racist idea, that Jews are a race. And I'm of the same opinion. I think this is essentially a Nazi idea that is being pushed, that Jews are a race. That is the Nazi ideology of Jews as a race. As far as I'm concerned, Judaism is a religion. If you follow that religion, you're Jewish. And if you don't follow the religion, you're not Jewish. You're just someone else. Maybe you're a Christian. Maybe you're an atheist. Maybe you're whatever. I just find it very strange, this concept of anti-Semitism and this sort of privileging. I don't see this race, and I just don't really comprehend it.
It's certainly been instrumentalized and weaponized by those with an agenda. And the point about Corbyn was that he didn't defend himself adequately. He immediately went on the back foot. Instead of saying from day one, from the outset, this is all complete fabricated nonsense. There's an agenda behind it. They're just out to get me because they don't like my policies critical of America, my socialist economic policies. This is just an instrument to undermine my credibility. I'm having none of it. There is no substance behind it. If he'd said that from day one, the outcome could not possibly have been worse, because he got the worst of all possible outcomes as it was. He was defenestrated, discredited, and is now a miserable old man up the road in Islington. Lucky if he gets re-elected, even as an independent.
Defenestrated, that means thrown out of a window.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I was wondering, I've asked you this before, but not on camera. What is your policy regarding NATO then? Do you see NATO as an aggressor in both the actions of Israel over in Palestine, but also in Ukraine?
Yes, NATO is a liability to this country. The only conflicts that we've got involved in over the last 3 decades, we've been dragged in by NATO, or more particularly by its leader, America. We were dragged into the Afghanistan conflict because America got targeted for its own actions in the Middle East. We got dragged then into the so-called war on terrorism, again as a result of NATO actions. We got dragged into the war in Iraq, which was partly in defense of Israel, and we got dragged by NATO into the Ukraine war. And now, although NATO is not directly involved as a military organization, but the Gaza conflict, we've got dragged into that, sending our ships for the Royal Navy to defend Israel by bombing Yemen. So NATO, far from being important to our security, is a liability. And our party believed that we should no longer be a member of NATO. We would call a referendum on membership of NATO.
That sounds interesting. And you think you win?
If we were given a fair crack of the whip, as happened with Brexit, you'll recall that David Cameron, when he offered a Brexit referendum, was convinced that the public would vote to stay in. I suspect that much of the same could happen with NATO, especially, and I read today that Germany is preparing to introduce conscription for 18-year-olds. If we start to go down that road, I have very little doubt that the public would welcome a chance to have a say on membership of NATO.
Germany's introducing conscription?
There is a serious option now before the German Bundestag, their parliament, with one of the options, conscription at age 18, because they say they must prepare for conflict with Russia.
Oh, my God. Well, to think after everything that Germany started rearming and now they're reintroducing conscription, that seems to have sent us back, what is it, 70 years?
It is utter madness the way NATO has advanced its borders right up to the Russian border. Now, Estonia, I also read in the papers today that we have British parachute regiment operating just kilometers away from the Russian border, exercises in Estonia.
And all it takes is for one slip across the border by accident, one plane to drop parachutes in the wrong place, and suddenly you've got a diplomatic incident.
Especially when you have people like Lord Cameron saying that we must be ready for war with Russia and be prepared to allow Ukraine to use British weapons which would strike deep in the heart of Russia. We are just one bad accident away from war with Russia.
And you're saying this as a diplomat with all of this experience?
Absolutely, but I'm afraid experience and judgment are disqualifications for having a say in British foreign policy.
And can we just clarify on Ukraine? The war in Ukraine started with a coup by the West in 2014, didn't it?
The so-called Maidan revolution, which was another fabricated incident that precipitated the coup, the CIA engineered coup, and which then led to a sequence of actions culminating in Ukraine welcoming in US troops for training, stationing of US weaponry near the Russian border, and preparations for Ukraine's full membership of NATO. It was inevitable that Russia would feel provoked.
Well, what I find weird is you've got this coup. You've even got leaks of, I believe it's the Americans saying that they're going to put in this person or that person as president. You've got Zelensky, who's clearly been teed up as a president with this whole TV show of him being the president, and then he's his party runs under the same party name. So this has clearly been created. But they had a coup. We know there was a coup in 2014. then the eastern regions in Donetsk, etc., go, well, we don't recognise this new government. We are Russian speaking. And the whole of the east of the country is generally pro-Russian. They go, okay, if you're going to do this, then we want to have our independence. So they didn't even have a coup. They just said, we declare independence. And the war's been going on since 2014. I find it strange that most people don't know that the war has been going on since 2014, and they're still labouring under this fantasy that, oh, it was unprovoked Russian aggression, which is nonsense. It wasn't unprovoked Russian aggression. NATO has been advancing, and they overthrew the elected government of Ukraine, which chose to ally itself with Russia.
This is very similar to Gaza. You get these narratives constructed, and the starting point is that history begins with October 7, or with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you ignore totally all the circumstances leading up to October 7 or to Russia feeling provoked. And this, when you ignore totally the backstory, you can get away, as the British and other Western governments try to do, you can get away with pulling the wool over people's eyes and accusing Russia constantly of being unprovoked, or Israel of just responding and defending itself. But there was, in each case, a very important backstory.
I agree. And I think, frankly, a lot of this has been lost. Obviously, from my perspective, it seems to me like the last thing we should do is get involved, because what is being sent over is you've got money going over towards Palestine or Hamas. You've got money going over towards the Israeli government. This is just funding both of these factions, and we saw during the lockdowns what the Israeli governments were up to. You know, it was absolutely horrific what the Israeli government was doing. Now, I was on George Galloway's Twitter, and it's just bits of children. Literally just bits of children. That ruined my dinner. And similarly, over in Ukraine, you've got Putin, who doesn't believe in free speech. He's pursuing, you've seen the Tucker Carlson interview, he's pursuing this denazification. He doesn't recognise that people have the right to have these views. So he's going to come in and he wants to wipe anyone out. But at the same time, he was clearly provoked. And you've got Zelensky, who's also corrupt. So in both cases, you've got two sides definitely with flaws on both sides. So what is your plan? Are you going to cut off the money going in there and cut off the Western involvement? I mean, you can put diplomatic pressure and do sanctions maybe, but what are you going to be sending money to one side? Because that's something that would concern me, and it would concern a lot of other people.
Well, one of a major focus for us is to stop wasting money on Royal Navy operations in exclusive support of Israel. Sending a warship, HMS Diamond, to the Red Sea and keeping it on station for months on end, using it as a platform to help guide RAF operations from Cyprus at the Akrotiri base, all that cost tens of millions of our taxpayer pounds. And then there's the stationing of ships offshore from Gaza, the mounting of RAF aerial surveillance to help the Israelis with target acquisition. All this against a resistance group that has never attacked Britain. Our main focus is on this, because we think there's a chance of getting a result. And we see even the Labour Party now are edging towards calling for an arms embargo on Israel. They're still afraid to go the whole hog, but thanks in part to our pressure, they are themselves being forced to go down that path. The government, meanwhile, are digging their heels in. I heard David Cameron just this morning on TV reckoning that because we only supply 1% of Israel's arms imports, it wasn't called for us to stop our arms sales? Well, the answer to that is, well, if it's only 1%, it's not going to hurt them anyway, so just do it.
Well, I mean, if you were supplying 1% of Hamas's weapons, I imagine you would instantly be in a cell, wouldn't you?
Exactly.
That
And
would
these
be
are war
taken very
criminals.
serious.
These are war criminals. In the estimation of the International Court of Justice, there is a case to be answered by Israel. Even the US State Department concluded this last week that there is a case for believing that Israel has been engaged in breaking international law, in other words, committing war crimes. So this country is an ancillary to crime.
Right. Well, one other thing that I'd like to ask you about is, I know this is going to be a slight pivot, but I'd like to ask you about Julian Assange, because Julian Assange has obviously exposed a lot of what's gone in the Middle East, and George Galloway has been one of the most vocal supporters of Assange going back a decade. I remember him originally getting pilloried as per usual for coming out in his support of Assange. So is the Workers' Party behind Assange, and is Assange actually going to be a central pillar of your platform in a way that it just wasn't under Jeremy Corbyn?
Yes, 100%. We have no qualms about supporting Julian. George has been there on the important occasions when the court has been coming to their judgments. No doubt he'll be prominent in the coming next 10 days when I think the High Court will deliver a final judgment. Yes, because the case of Julian, he's our political prisoner. He hasn't been convicted of any crime. He hasn't even been charged with any crime as such. They haven't defined the crime that no charges have been laid either in Britain or even America. So he's a political prisoner by any definition. And he's being kept in these inhumane conditions alongside high security prisoners in Belmarsh. His health has been deteriorating for a long time. So Julian deserves every support, and he will get it from the Workers' Party.
Well, I remember I've interviewed his wife. I've interviewed his father. And were you there when he got married? Were you at his wedding?
No, but I've met Stella.
They had the wedding party. So I think it was about 4 people actually got to go in, including, I think, Craig Murray. And everyone else was outside on this strip of grass outside the prison by this main road. And, someone said, "Oh, do you want a piece of wedding cake?" And I went, "This is ridiculous." I'm being given a piece of Julian Assange's wedding cake. He can't even eat his own wedding cake. And his wedding cake is sitting here on a sort of porter table outside a prison, and then inside the prison, that's where I think it was only 3 or 4 people actually got to go inside. It's mad.
It's so inhumane. And his real crime, of course, is that he drew attention to the war crimes being committed by the Western powers, and particularly America, in the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts. That was his crime, for revealing the war crimes committed by others.
Yeah, you've seen the collateral murder video, obviously.
Yeah.
I do think that there is a bit of censorship going on with it. Or I don't know whether it's because the mainstream media trying to suppress the story, but whenever we were putting out Assange videos, they just did not gain traction. And it was a weird sort of thing. Can I ask, are you in favour of where the opponent is a government? Because I know there's a lot of arguments different ways when there are witnesses, etc. But having cameras in courtrooms and broadcasting it where the prosecution is a government, because I don't understand if the prosecution is the government and the government is the one who's supposedly been wronged in this case, why you would not have cameras in a courtroom. I can understand if there are, there's a member of the public, they don't want to be publicise as the supposed victim. There's arguments to sensitivity there. I would say publicise it anyway, but I can understand, and I could flip flop. But where it's Assange versus this faceless bureaucracy, surely you should have the right to have cameras in that courtroom.
To be honest, I haven't given it much thought, but prima facie, I would strongly support the right of someone who is being, not even, I was going to say accused, but Julian isn't even accused. The issue is whether it would be legal to extradite him. That this should have full exposure. When it's a case of the government against Joe Soap, the Joe public, there should always be a right of full exposure, and the cameras should be there.
Well, one thing that they did during the lockdowns was they closed off most of the seats in the public gallery because of their woo-woo superstition. And then on top of that, they kept 2 seats empty. So that's 2 seats, and obviously all the seats that they've now taped off with their yellow tape because watch out, you'll catch the lurgy or something. So this was 6, 7 seats, and those 2 were held for the Australians, the Australian embassy, who never turned up. So they didn't say. And also, this is a public gallery. It's not. It's not the government gallery.
Yeah.
If the government wants to be there, then they can actually sit behind the barrister. They can actually sit in there if they're government officials. But it seems to me, they purposefully tried to stop scrutiny, and they tried to stop people getting in and reporting on the case. And when I report on the case, all I can do is report from outside, and it's like people can't see what's going on. People are becoming more and more fascinated by what goes on in courts. Like, the most mainstream one is going to be Johnny Depp, Amber Heard. The whole world became interested in that one. Even, World of Warcraft live streamers started streaming that because they went, wow, this is really interesting. Another one, Carl Rittenhouse, right? People, I think it really pays for people to be able to see what goes on in the courts, especially in an internet age. People aren't used to going down to the courts themselves. These used to be packed. They used to be a form of entertainment. And all of Fleet Street is between the High Court and the Old Bailey for a reason. Because it's access to these courts, and it used to be in all the newspapers, and they used to have teams and teams of reporters focusing on court cases. Now they don't exist.
It reminds me of the debate about televising Parliament. It was taboo for many years, and now we've got totally used to it. It's a big yawn most of the time. Hopefully things will move that way with court cases, but it won't unless people like ourselves push for it.
I want to speak to you a little bit more about free speech, and I want to know how much you and also the Workers' Party, so you can answer for both, you can answer both together or you can answer separately if you like, support free speech, because and a lot of people in this country believe in our tradition of free speech, that we should be able to say whatever we like, regardless of if it upsets or offends someone or alarms them, or they call it, alarm, distress. I believe that people should be able to say whatever they want, including, anything bigoted, anything racist. At the end of the day, I was taught by my nan growing up, sticks and stones can break your bones, but words can never hurt me. Are you of that opinion, and will you fight for us to have a First Amendment or even new insertion into the Bill of Rights here to defend our right to free speech?
Personally, yes, 100%. I think it's a terrible failure on our part that we don't have an equivalent to the American First Amendment. There is far more respect for, at least in theory, in America, for free speech, and there is something there in the Constitution that people can point to. It does count for something, and it's shameful that in this country, in our partial democracy, we don't have an equivalent.
I think in a way we do have that right, but the problem is that it's implied. So if you look at, the Magna Carta, if you look at the Bill of Rights, these things are enshrined, but it's almost enshrined as if it's common sense, and so it's not explicitly stated. Where I think, because the Bill of Rights was 1688, 1689, I think the Americans got to the point where they went, okay, we need to be really explicit so people really get what this says. And even then, you look at the right to bear arms and it says, shall not be infringed. And they go, yes, but obviously we cannot have people having automatic weapons, and you need to have a permit. It's like, shall not be infringed. So it's a strange one, isn't it? But I'm glad to hear that. So is the Workers' Party also on that line that people should have the right to free speech, regardless of how abhorrent, so long as they're not harassing someone and chasing someone down? Should they have that right?
To be honest, the Workers' Party doesn't have a fully worked out position on this important issue. Our manifesto doesn't have much to say on this subject. But within the party, many of us, including myself, think very much along those lines. And as opportunities come up, that's the direction in which we will be pushing. And we deplore these attempts to demonize free speech. The anti-Semitism is the most obvious case, where you can't use the word Zionism without being accused of being anti-Semitic. This corruption of language is utterly deplorable.
Yeah, and even if someone does want to, let's say attack Judaism or anything like that, or even be racist, they have a right to speak. And if you don't want to listen, you don't have to listen. If someone wants to be racist against me, it's just words. It's literally just words. I can ignore them. In fact, you've got the Digital Communications Act, I believe, 2003, because you had Mark Meacham up in Scotland. I've met him before. He's a Scottish comedian. He was convicted of causing fear, alarm, distress, etc. Because he made a joke video in which he was saying that his girlfriend's dog was a Nazi. So he obviously he's not a Nazi, but it shouldn't matter whether he is or not. He was saying, see Carl, and this dog would lift its little paw. And he put it in front of a laptop and he was playing Adolf Hitler on the laptop. So in order for this to somehow make sense, it would have to mean that the dog was actually a Nazi. And I'm like, it literally, it can't even make sense. You can't possibly take this thing seriously.
Yes, it's been taken too far, this concern, understandable concern for insulting racist language, began with the American Civil Rights Movement, for which commands respect. I think that someone who shouted insulting language in the face of someone who's not white like me should be some sort of crime. I don't know if it's an offence against a speech offence or insulting behaviour offence, but there ought to be a limit on insulting behaviour, I would say.
Really? Because look, if someone harassed me, right, because of my skin colour, then it wouldn't matter whether it were my skin colour or not. Okay, they could harass me for my skin colour, they could harass me for what I'm wearing, they can harass me because they don't like my politics. Surely we should just get rid of all of this special protected group status, all of this, race crime nonsense, and just say, look, if you harass someone, you harass someone. It just seems to me like they're creating more and more of this legislation, this statute. And it just doesn't need to exist. If someone says something offensive, at the end of the day, if they're harassing me, that's harassment. Do we need this censorship?
Well, it raises the question of whether there can be such a thing as verbal violence. And words can hurt as much as blows. causing psychological damage and amounting to provocation. I honestly don't know. And as I say, we don't have a fully worked out party position on this, but our tendency would be to say it's gone too far. All these isms, protecting this, that, and the other ism has gone too far.
And hate crime as well. Like this concept of hate crime. You Raw Milk, who I've been talking to you about the band, they've got a song, "Hate, Is That a Crime?" And this concept of, if someone punched me in the face because they didn't like my shoes, they might get done. Let's just say they get done for 6 months. But if they punched me in the face because they didn't like my skin, then they would add another 3 months onto that. That to me just completely abolishes the concept of double jeopardy. You're trying someone twice for the same crime. I think people should be punished on the harm that they caused or the harm that they intend to cause. It shouldn't be about their political motivations behind it, because and it shouldn't be because you're part of a group, because it takes away from the sort of spirit of English law, which, you know, people talk about minorities. Well, the greatest, in the words of Ayn Rand, the greatest minority of all is the individual. So this collectivization, this group identity, I see it as quite dangerous, right? The idea that people must be categorized because they're black, or people must be categorized because they're homosexual. And if you say something about one homosexual, you have then attacked the entire group, and then now you are homophobic, etc. I see that as absolutely toxic.
I'm tempted to agree, but it's a deep question with a lot of ramifications. What I'd say is that we're on the wrong trajectory now. This expansion of the concept of a hate crime, it's going too far, and it's becoming a cloak for repression.
Well, what I'm sort of getting at is, are we just going to pause it? Because sort of what we've seen in some ways with the Tories and Labour, the ones who sort of push this, and people say, okay, the Tories are Labour driving at the speed limit, right? So all the Tories do is they say, okay, well, that what they're proposing now is too far, but we'll keep it as it is. I'm wondering whether you're going to push back and say, okay, let's reverse and go back to the concept that everyone has fundamental rights. No, we don't acknowledge this concept of group identity under English law. And if someone goes after you, we're going to treat that as going after an individual, which is all that matters, right? And just get rid of all of this group intersectional Marxist or intersectional socialist identity. Or you might call it neo-socialism, this, you know, group.
That would be our sort of direction of travel, and I suspect that no other party represented in Westminster would go even that far.
I would probably agree with you. So I want to move on because we've talked about the right to free speech. Is it okay if I quickly run through some other rights with you, if that's okay?
Sure.
So a lot of people, obviously, we've seen what's happened with the lockdowns, the tyranny. We've seen that the courts are corrupt. We've seen the government's corrupt. We've seen police violently beating peaceful protesters, and people are terrified of their government. Will you stand by the right to bear arms, which is already enshrined within our Bill of Rights?
The right to bear arms?
Yep. So the crime would be using those arms against someone. So if you've harmed someone, that's a crime.
Yeah.
Having a weapon in itself, unless you can show in an intent to use it, should be completely fine.
I'd have doubts myself about relaxing the existing restrictions on bearing firearms and other weapons. As a private citizen, I feel safer for there being such restrictions. I wouldn't be in favour of relaxing those restrictions. That said, during the lockdown, I did see a certain logic in the American position, because I think the fact that the citizens had arms in their homes did make the feds a bit more respectful.
Well, I saw some clips of some of the protests in New Hampshire, and which were meant to be banned, and it's just a bunch of libertarians standing around with signs and, you know, assault rifles, just politely waving, and the police come on the little bicycles with the little pistols. They go, "You're right there," and they go, "Yeah," and they go, "Okay," and they go and cycle on. Because a lot of people will try and compare, violence over here to violence in the United States. But I think of the United States as one great and more like single unit is ridiculous. If you take somewhere like New Hampshire, New Hampshire doesn't require any permits to go and get a gun. Anyone can go and get a gun. And the only reason they issue permits is for you to use them in another state and to facilitate you going into another state where you require a permit. And it just doesn't exist. You've got high gun ownership in places like Switzerland, but I'd say New Hampshire is, it's the free state. They say live free or die. Would you not say that the problems with violence that we see are not driven by weapons? Because now they're going after knives. Like I, as everyone knows, always carry a knife with me. I always carry a pocket knife. The scouts always carry knives. In fact, even the police generally carry knives. Generally, Leathermans are very popular amongst the police. I'm worried about the police hitting me with sticks. I'm not necessarily worried about them stabbing me with a Leatherman that they pull out their pocket. That just doesn't seem to be the main method of attack. Would you say it's cultural? What was it that Homer said? He said the blade itself incites to deeds of violence. Do you genuinely believe that?
It's cultural. I deplore the fact that we're evolving into a culture that's more tolerant of bearing weapons. I think it's deplorable that people feel a need to bear a weapon to defend themselves. I think we should be trying to encourage a culture more like my wife's own East African culture, where it's thoroughly frowned on for anyone to carry any kind of weapon. And this cultural attitude acts as the police. It's community policing. And I think this is much more healthy than moving in the direction of, let everybody carry a knife because they might need it in self-defense.
Are those two opposed? I'm completely fine with...
A bit like smoking.
Yeah.
Years ago, it was accepted that most people would smoke. It wasn't seen as a bad habit. It wasn't seen as deplorable. But culturally now it's deeply frowned on, seen as antisocial. And by and large, people don't.
Well, I think I would be completely open to that. The thing is, if people want to, disapprove of me carrying a knife, that's completely their right. And I just say... Obviously, I've not stabbed anyone. Otherwise, they would have locked me up. Hell, they're trying to lock me up for things that I haven't done. And one thing that I'm concerned about is Labour at the moment are pushing through. And the Tories as well. They're looking at this idea of a crossbow ban. Obviously, I have my own crossbows. The idea that I, who haven't harmed anyone, who have no intention of harming anyone, could be put in prison for simply owning a crossbow. I think it sort of it goes back to John Locke, life, liberty, property. Should you have the right to own something, and so long as you don't harm anyone with it, should you have the right to own it, whether it's a gun, whether it's a crossbow, whether it's a knife? Everyone owns knives. They're in everyone's kitchen. Yeah,
well, I have to own up. I'm a social conservative. George Galloway is a social conservative. If you had to stick a label on our party, we would say we were socially conservative. And because that's where we think our demographic of supporters are. And we're with them on that. So we tend to frown on guns and knives and crossbows.
That's weird, because I would say so. It's socially conservative to believe that people, like traditionally, if you look at our tradition, like it's in the Bill of Rights. This is something that I consider to be very English. In fact, we had next to no restrictions whatsoever. If you go back just 100 years, And all of these restrictions have been brought back at the same time the government has increased. And there was never enough crime using them to justify it. And I just find it very strange. I find it very strange that there's about one crossbow killing every few years, and now they want to start locking people like me up for owning a crossbow and saying, no, I'm not going to get a slip of paper to give me permission. I don't feel that I have to. And as long as I've not harmed anyone, I don't think I'm committing a crime.
So you'd be happy if I pulled a machine gun out on you?
I'd be perfectly happy for you to come in here with a gun on your hip. And so, look, like, I think the crime is in the action. I think anything can be used as a weapon. For example, a coffee mug. I know this one's flimsy. If you had a proper solid coffee mug, you could use that as a weapon. I'm happy walking into anyone's house and into their kitchen where they have a whole rack of weapons just sitting there ready to be pulled out and used for chopping vegetables. Like whenever you walk down the street, any car could be used to kill someone, as we've seen from ISIS and whatever. Like, everything is a weapon if you put your mind to it. I think that we just have to, culturally as a society, move forward and get rid of a lot of the root causes of the crime itself, the violence itself, because knives don't commit crime, people commit crime. And actually, that brings me on to one of the main root causes. Obviously, one of the causes is, the breakup of family units, but the other is the war on drugs. Where are you guys on this, on prohibition?
Well, as I say, we're socially conservative, and I'm sorry if it disappoints, but we're rather disapproving on drugs. To be honest, we don't have a fully worked out party position on this. We're not going to be the government. We don't have illusions or pretend that we have a full program because we're going to be the government tomorrow. We don't. We won't. But
That's
we have a tendency. We will support legislation that will go in certain directions, or we will campaign for something, but we will not be campaigning, I have to say, for legalization of drugs or anything of that nature.
So you think it's okay to lock someone up for possession of a drug, even if they've not caused any harm to anyone else? So, to be honest, I think we know about how half the country smokes weed. Little old ladies, right, living in their cottages out in the countryside are smoking weed. I just find it very strange that people are being considered criminals for taking drugs. I know George doesn't drink, does he?
I don't know, to be honest.
I remember that from
I'm aware he's not a teetotaler, but
I just find it very strange because for me, traditionally, and being socially conservative will be more about socially campaigning, putting social pressure and leading by example. So saying, look, I think that everyone should stop drinking. I think alcohol is an absolute terrible pest, but you have the right to do it. Would you agree with that stance, or would you still say, no, I believe that people should be locked up to disincentivize rather than just encourage them and rely on them coming about as of their own free will?
I would say that the law as it stands should be applied. The police shouldn't be put in the awkward position of letting things go, and so you get patchy appliance of the law. There should be consistent application of the law, which tries to discourage consumption and sale. It works in Japan, where there is very little drug traffic or drug-related crime. It could work elsewhere. But in terms of practical politics in this country, I just have to say that we would not be supporting any relaxation of current legislation or practices.
Okay. So with regards to juries and the court system, are you in favour of an expansion of the right to trial by jury? Because throughout the lockdowns, and I know you've been a freedom fighter during the lockdowns, we've seen a lot of people taken into magistrates' courts. We've even seen people like Tommy Robinson. Obviously, I know you vocally disagree with him on his Israel support, but I think we can all see that he's been stitched up using the magistrates' courts to give him the maximum sentence of 6 months. Do you think that the government should be able to, and bearing in mind, a lot of these people aren't magistrates, they're district judges, so they're actually state employees rather than the volunteers from the community who are simply remunerated and only do a few days a year. These are essentially full-time judges. So it's just the state putting people in prison with no right to a jury. Could you see a move away from that to make it so that prison sentences required a jury?
I would personally support that position. As you say, during lockdown, it was an eye-opener for many of us. But I saw enough of what I call the British injustice system, and you've been on the receiving end as well, to be disabused of any illusions and to see that more safeguards are needed. And the jury system is one of the most valuable safeguards. I'd be in favour of expanding it to cover any lengthy custodial, or possibly even any custodial sentence.
That is wonderful, because I don't think most people don't talk about it. Most people don't know about it. And one thing that I want to do on here is actually talk more about the court system, because people completely ignore the courts. So one thing as well, in 1967, until 1967, we had jury unanimity, which meant if you were put on trial, you would require 12 out of 12 people in order to convict. And the principle was, better 10 guilty people walk free than one innocent person have their life ruined and be imprisoned. They switched that one day in 1967, and they took away what I would consider to be a constitutional right, and I would say that that was an ultra vires act of Parliament, because I believe that's fundamental and foundational. I don't believe they had the right to take that. They changed that, so 2 out of those 12 people could go, no, Peter's innocent. I completely believe he's innocent. He's totally innocent. We cannot convict him. I believe he's innocent. 2 people could be screaming that, and they could still put you in prison. And it's been like that since 1967. I believe that's an abomination. They don't have that in the States. The States never corrupted in that way. Do you believe that we should return to that, considering how much people are sheep? Because I've reported on numerous trials, and you see in the trials that there is one person, and during the lockdowns as well, we saw the proportion of people who actually came out and stood up on the marches may have been, or really did something to fight back, may have been about 1 in 12. Because there's always that one person, and they hold out and they hold out and they hold out for the 2 hours, 10 minutes. And after that 2 hours, 10 minutes, they say, go on, reach a majority verdict. It can be 10 to 2, and they come back in guilty. Do you, because most of them, they're waiting. Sometimes it's only one person who has that courage to stand up to the rest of the jury, stand up to 11 people gathered around them, saying, I want to go home, I've got to get back to my kids, I've got, my business is going to fall apart if I don't get back to it. I don't want to be stuck in this room anymore. I'm going mad. I'm tearing my hair out. And it's very rare to find someone who'll just go, I don't care, because I'm not going to send an innocent person to prison.
But there was that famous film with Henry Fonda, wasn't there? 12 Just Men, that highlighted this issue. I would want to study the academic literature. I'm sure there is some. I'm not familiar with it, on how majority verdicts have panned out, how successful has it been. There are other considerations. How full the prisons are. Do we have enough prisons? Because there are implications of going back to the pre-67 requirement of unanimity. It would keep people tend to keep more people out
Yeah.
of prison, wouldn't it?
Which would be useful in a way if it were
It
putting
would
more
thin
people
the
in.
numbers
Yeah.
in the overcrowded prisons. That would be a consideration. On the other hand, some criminals would get away scot-free. I would really want to look at the academic literature on this.
I think it would be lovely for you to be having this conversation now, drawing it to your attention within the Workers' Party, right? And speak with your colleagues and actually have a think about it, because it's an issue that no one knows about and is ignored. And I'm just concerned because most political parties that I come across, they completely ignore it. Can I ask you then as well?
Yeah, can I just
Yeah.
say our slogan is "Power to the People." So, in principle, we want the people to have more direct say in our democracy, whether it's through referenda or representation in Parliament, and by the same principle, power to the people on juries. But when you get into the fine detail, I think it requires serious ponderation of all the considerations. And what you would not want is a system where jury tampering became more prevalent. The requirement for unanimity means that the bad guys, the mafia, could just pressure a single person and they'd stop their honcho being put away. That could lead to less power for the people.
I do see that being a possibility, but I see it being extremely unlikely because of the way that jurors are selected and the way that jurors can be completely cloistered away during high-profile trials, and also the amount of surveillance that the state has got. I think the state is so powerful at this point that we're not looking at large, Cray twin-like organisations. I don't think that's going to be a significant issue. But I will let you.
Toxtus? I'm from Liverpool. It's a rough area.
Well, I think maybe if the police focused on actual crime, that maybe they could round up the gangsters, both on the streets and also in Parliament. So, civic policing. Do you believe that we should go back towards the Peelian policing principles and essentially demilitarise the police? When the police were first formed, obviously, you could walk around carrying a revolver in your pocket, okay, through the streets, and that was completely fine. The police were not allowed to carry those weapons. They weren't allowed to carry guns unless they were responding to a specific incident like that. Should we move back to that? Because currently they've got tasers, they've got pepper spray, they've got batons. If you get caught with any one of these, they'll lock you up. But they go and they willfully and openly use these on peaceful protesters or journalists or just innocent people. Should we demilitarize? Because if you actually look at them, they don't look like the people. The reason they wear suits is because they were meant to. It's within the policing principles. The police are the public, and the public are the police. The idea is they are simply us, right? And we all have a duty to look out and stop crime and intercede. And we all have a right to conduct an arrest. Some people call it a citizen's arrest.
Yeah.
Okay. But the idea is they are exactly the same as us, except they are paid to focus on this duty full time. Could we see them go back to suits and dropping some of this offensive weaponry that they have now armed themselves with?
Ideally, yes, but society itself is evolving in a way that possibly, arguably, makes arming the police more necessary. I say this with hesitation and regret. Many of us in the freedom movement have been on the receiving end of police brutality. But it's been brought home to me in the last 7 months with the protests, especially in London, that the police can also be the good guys. The police are currently being demonized, the Met are being demonized by the government and the right and the Tories and Labour, but for standing up for the right of people to march and to protest. I think they get a lot of credit in my book for that, and I would hesitate to advocate anything that chipped away at their position, especially in the current atmosphere. We want to be standing up for the police and call out the game that the government are playing, particularly over the protests. I think that...
Well, I've got to say that is particularly concerning to me, because even though I don't attend the Palestine marches, I don't actually really report on them, because my focus is on disengaging from what's going on overseas. I know obviously you're someone to go down to them, okay, and you see that as your mode of disengagement. I've got plenty of friends who are like that. But the idea that they simply want to ban these protests, when I know there are people like you down there, there are plenty of people from the Assange crowd who are down there, because there are bad people within the crowd, and obviously within any crowd, there's going to be a bad person that they'll find. Within a freedom protest, they'll find a bad person. Well, I'm sure you've met one or two bad people who've, you've gone, oh, I don't like that guy in a protest. And also this whole river to the sea thing. Well, they have the right to chant what they like. It's this concept of just shutting down protests. It disgusts me. And as much as I may disagree with some people on those protests, you can't shut them down. You can get them off of a statue. You can even slap a fine on someone who's climbing up a statue and saying it's some sort of public nuisance disorder, which they could do. But you can't just shut down the entire protest because of that. If people are called graffiti, anything, like, there are things you can do. But it's almost like the government has this sort of tactical stance where they purposefully don't use the existing powers that they have at their disposal in order to be granted new powers. Because we can't possibly do anything against, the Extinction Rebellion or insulate Britain. It's like, I've seen you grab people for obstructing a public highway. And they say, we need new powers. How could you possibly need new powers? You guys, there are so many pieces of statue. They passed about, over 3,000 bits of statue in a 10-year period. No one knows it. It's just become this absolute mess. That could you even think of 100 laws that we need? Just genuinely, did you think if you sat down for an hour that you could get to 100? Do you think that if you sat down for a year that you could ever get to 3,000 things that you actually would need people to obey?
And 99% of them are laws and regulations chipping away at freedoms or restricting freedoms. Rare is the case, but there is one important exception, the Freedom of Information Act, when in a fit of absent-mindedness, the Blair government at the time, or was it Brown, passed the Freedom of Information Act, which has been a boon.
And GDPR has also been one of the rare good things, because it actually protects the consumer's data, I would say.
Yes, yeah. But I see the police with slightly different eyes now as a result of their policing of the so-called hate marches, as described by Cruella Braverman, who I see today writes in the Telegraph advocating some amazingly left-wing measures like taxing the rich more. The woman is mad. But I digress. The police...
For usual standard patrols around an area, right? If, for example, you've got the possibility, the police usually always travel in their cars, right? Occasionally you see them on bikes, but usually always in their cars. Why can't they keep the weapons in the boot? Why can't they keep the stab-proof vests in the boot? They can have everything, all of their kit, all ready to go, right? They can even have a belt that goes, they can have a normal belt, they can have another belt that goes on. So they can have all of that on within 30 seconds. But unless they are dealing with an incident that requires them to put on all of this weaponry and armor and have all of this equipment in their hands, okay, and about them, so they turn into a paramilitary, can they not just wear a suit? Can they not just present themselves as the public and do patrols in their uniforms? And maybe one thing I've talked to, I think, David Curtin about was, rather than them carrying sticks, to actually focus, because the idea is they're meant to use this stick, the baton, for self-defense as well as offense. Have you ever heard of a buckler? A buckler. No. So it used to be back when there was sort of medieval fencing. It was just a very small shield. You could have a small plastic reinforced shield that could easily hang at the hip, and that would actually be far more defensive for defending the head, and if a knife is coming at them, to defend the hand, rather than have to put a stick out. It's almost like when there's a crisis situation, if there is a scuffle at a protest or something, what do they have to hand? Well, they only have offensive things. They don't have a shield. It only needs to be small to effectively begin to defend themselves. Whereas if you pull out a stick, okay, well, what's the things you can do with a stick? Well, you can try and block blows, or you can just whack the person in front of you to get back. Well, a shield, you've got it out. If they try and push into it, okay, push back, that's defence. Do you think we could move towards police having bucklers? Okay, because they could easily be conveniently carried, rather than all of this stuff, which they could access in a moment. They can have their tasers, they can have their pepper spray, they can even have guns. We've got armed police. But to be picked up and to be used when the incident requires, not all the time.
Is this not the position, though? I've been on marches for Palestine where the police had not been tooled up with all the armory that you describe. Surely it's an operational matter for tactical decision on the day in the light of perhaps intelligence received. As a marcher, I have felt reassured by knowing that the police were there, ready to protect us, not to repress us, to protect us, and they have been there, and that has been their main role for 7 months.
And I completely understand that. And if you say, look, there's likely to be this level of violence, etc., then we are going to need to deploy this. This would then have to be, if they're pre-preparing it, it would have to be pre-signed off by a higher rank. They would take responsibility for it, and there would be accountability. But there should always be the discussion, okay, the default should be, we're wearing suits until there's something that we see coming up where we shouldn't be wearing suits. And the last two times I think I've seen coppers in suits are when they came to my trial to commit perjury. Well, yes, they'll wear the formal police uniforms and everything. Like, they're never like that on the street. And then for the Jubilee, because it's a ceremonial occasion, I think the pride of England or Britain is that we had this civic policing, is that our police wore suits, is that our police that weren't running around with guns all of the time, that our police could go and get guns if they needed them. But this militarized police, it's fundamentally, it's very continental or very American, but I just don't feel that it reflects our character at all.
I fully agree. We don't want to go in that direction, but we have to leave the police a certain amount of tactical discretion.
Okay. Education. We've seen George come under attack from, Novara media and all of the rest of the mainstream media have all jumped on him because he's called out what the state schools are doing with sexualizing children and promoting homosexuality to children. Are you going to stand up for the right of parents to homeschool? And do you think that parents should be returned the taxes that they've paid for state schooling if they choose to homeschool? Because at the moment, they, to me, having worked in them, they seem like just state indoctrination factories, and they're undermining the community that would exist where parents raise their children, they pass on their values. It's now one set of values are being pushed in, and we see this in sort of who's been resisting against the government.
I don't think we want to move towards more homeschooling, because that would go against the interests of the working class. Only middle-class families could probably afford to do homeschooling, to buy in tutors or to be educated enough themselves to school their kids. Most working families need 2 salaries anyway. So school is, in a way, childcare, essential childcare. But rather, the emphasis should be on ensuring that schools don't become centres of pernicious indoctrination. And I think all that George was saying was that it's not desirable for particular beliefs about sexual behaviour to be foisted on children. In fact, indeed, it's a form of child abuse to bring them up to believe things which go against the beliefs of their parents, for example. Schools should not be involved in this sort of education at all. This should be more a matter for homeschooling, if you like, that all matters sexual should be taught at home.
Well, I completely understand that. Yes, those things should be taught at home, but the problem is, aren't you going to have an institutional bias within institutions? And isn't there the power for, let's say you get into government, let's say you just absolutely knock the ball out the park, you get into government, you have a run of 5 years, and then another party gets in. Okay, so you don't do any indoctrinating for your 5 years, they get in, and immediately it's back into a machine of indoctrination. You see how this would be a problem. And surely, you talked about it not being accessible to the working class. Well, surely the thing that's keeping it from being accessible to the working class, I think they spend about £6,000 per year per pupil, is the fact that this money, which could be in the home, so if you had 3 kids, let's say that's 18 grand, or even if they gave them half that, if you said to a working class family, you can have half, that's 9 grand, okay, a year to raise your own kids, that would enable working class families who long to raise their own children, who long to be able to stay at home. And you talk about being a social conservative. This is like, state schooling is a very modern phenomenon, and it does take the woman out of the home.
Stop you there, Wilsey. Think of lockdown and how children suffered through not going to school. School is not just learning the 3 R's. It's about socialization. It's about enjoyment. It's about a lot more than education.
Do you know what I'm going to do, Peter? I think that you don't fully get what homeschooling can be. So I'm going to give you an invite to come down to Hope Sussex and see what we can do at a community centre where children fully do socialise, and you actually can educate, and kids can work together in groups, and they have friends and they play together. I think you're thinking of it as in some sort of weird thing where you've only got the one parent and the children and they never let them see anyone else. Actually, a lot of homeschooling that you get will be 3 different families will bring all of their children together, and then those kids, they go play in a football game, they've got friends across the street, they've got all their family and their relatives. So actually you tend to get even more strengthened communities, and you do get a lot of socialization. And what you'd see is people taking the local church hall or taking the local any space that they've got locally, maybe they find a room at the local library, and using that room to educate their children together, right, themselves. Maybe it's not the specific parent doing it every day. Maybe they share it around. Maybe they bring in family members. But it's a myth, is what I'm saying, that it deprives kids of socialization. It's only if parents deliberately did that, and right now they could do that anyway. But I think it really has been taken out of the hands of the working class, because if you gave parents the full amount of money, that's 18 grand a year. How many families would take that up, and one of them would stay home, or even could just go part-time? Say, I'm going to do 2 days, and our neighbours over the road, they're going to do 3 days a week.
Well, this smacks to me of the privatization of education, and
It's
I think it's been a very much a working class concern to have a right to state-provided education in the same way that people attach high value to the National Health Service. It's a worker's right to have an education off the state, but it needs to be the right education. Much easier just to ensure that the schools go back to teaching and stop indoctrination.
You say that with a socialist zeal in your eyes and a trust for government, and I'm afraid that I don't share your trust. I think traditionally, I know like many people haven't experienced this, but I see what it's like for parents who actually get to have a say in their own kids' education and who get to be there. When you in your life, I'm sure the people who your parents or whoever, your family who raised you, you do things in your life and you think about the person who taught you about that, and you think about the role that they played. Having that from a parent, a grandparent, and having your family teach you that, it builds relationships, because right now we're seeing an complete intergenerational breakdown, and this is something that didn't exist before.
But with so many one-parent families now, I think in practical terms it would be very difficult for a single parent to organize education for their child, even if the state give them several £1,000s, and look after them in every other respect as well. This sounds to me like a utopia that wouldn't work in most of the country.
I'm going to bring you down to hope. It's an open invite. I'm going to bring you down, and I'm going to change your mind, Peter.
Deal.
Right. One of the last few things that I wanted to talk about is mass migration. Traditionally, and I know that you've sort of pitched the Workers' Party as being akin to old Labour. Traditionally, old Labour was opposed to mass migration because it saw a lot of migrants come in, and that would depress wages, because obviously what happens, I can't remember which way round it is for the camera, but it's a shift in supply to the right, which then lowers wages because it's an increase in quantity. At the same time, housing has gone from, say, 10% of someone's income up to about 50% of someone's income. Mass migration has drastically hit the working class. Is the Workers' Party, and do you believe that we need to have strong limits on migration?
We're not in favour of mass immigration, not by a long chalk, and it's the most underprivileged communities that have had to bear the brunt of a lot of uncontrolled migration. A lot of seaside towns already suffering neglect have had to find accommodation and provide already stretched services. So we're very much against that. People are not being racist by raising these concerns. It's a very legitimate concern. There are no easy remedies. No gimmicks like Rwanda are not going to help. None of the parties has an answer to this. It's deep-rooted. There would have to be fundamental change in the way the economy is conducted. to solve this problem, better training, better incentives for native British workers to go into professions like care, traditionally underfunded. It would require a considerable structural change. In the meanwhile, we do need a lot of migrants, but it's not a subject that should become a political football. But the Workers' Party will support any sensible measures to control, in particular, the illegal migration. But our main concern is to stop these foreign wars, which precipitate much of the migration. When you think about the countries where the boat migrants come from, they're mostly from countries that we have bombed. Think about it: the Afghanistans, refugees, the Iraqis, Kurds,
Libyans,
some Iranians, a country under sanctions, Syrians, Libyans, former French colonies that have been oppressed under the French colonial system and post-colonial system. So if the West stops bombing and oppressing, that is dealing with the root causes of much of the illegal migration. That is our novel argument. None of the other parties says deal with illegal migration at the root, remove the causes, which so often are due to our warmongering. Look at all these Ukrainians. They may be white, they may not appear to be much of a problem, but you say that to the Irish, where they have a real problem with numbers of Ukrainian migrants. It's just less visible.
Well, I'd like to also talk about one issue with the culture, because a lot of people feel that their culture is being eroded by mass migration, and they feel that there's no integration. Because back in the day, if you came over to Britain, you had to learn to speak English, right? You didn't have massive enclaves of migrants who would segregate, so you had to generally integrate. And what we've seen over time is segregated communities grow within Britain who most British people don't see as British, who often in many cases, and most times to me when I speak to migrants, will not identify themselves as British. But they are a lot of these migrants, whether they're born of two migrant parents, but they're raised within a migrant family, they're raised to be from Pakistan, or whether they're raised to be from Greece or somewhere else. Those people are allowed to vote in our elections. Should people be given British citizenship just because they're born here, or should British citizenship be determined by descent from British people, or, in addition, someone risking their life to defend this country, as I know a number of people have done, whether it's in the Gurkhas or even in the Second World War?
Migrants have brought an enormous amount to this country. When I was canvassing for George in Rochdale, I was struck actually not by how separate the communities were, but how much they were in common, and how all Rochdalians speak with the same accent, the same Rochdale, Lancashire accent. And they all go to the same schools. And over the generations, assimilation is taking place. But in both directions, we white Brits have learnt to appreciate curries. That's the most obvious example, but it's more subtle than that. We're also learning to support Palestine and to open our eyes to our own colonial history and how it continues, our in post-imperial behavior.
I think where we disagree here is, I see culture as being, and the identity of the demos as being passed down through families, right? And I see state school, and we were just talking about this, I see state schooling as an abomination, which is interrupting this culture of what it means to be British. you see state school as something that integrates foreigners into this country, whereas personally, I don't recognise that at all. In fact, I think it's taking the identity of the demos itself out of the British people. So I don't think that a foreigner being raised within a state school is in any way making them British. I see it as generational. You know, my nan, I was raised by my two nans. They taught me about our Bill of Rights. They taught me about the Magna Carta. I grew up where we were in a minority in my school. I've grown up in London. Okay, us English people were in the minority, and the other kids weren't taught about this. The other kids didn't have this passed down to them, and that deeply, deeply concerns me, because now I have people voting in our elections who aren't from that lineage. Aren't from a and that is our lineage. That is the British lineage. It's the Bill of Rights. It's the Magna Carta, right? It's the English Civil War and standing up against a tyrannical king. People aren't from that lineage, and therefore I don't consider them to be part of the demos. I think them being given a vote is just, I see that as a rigged election, because unless you're part of the demos, then you shouldn't be allowed to vote. That deeply concerns me. And that's why I consider it to be essentially illegitimate, the elections that we have.
So you're saying nationality is just a matter of blood and kinship?
Definitely. I see two ways to gain nationality. I think either you are descended, like you could be adopted, right? But I believe you have to be raised by a British family. So you can be adopted, right? You can be like maybe one parent is English, one parent's not. That doesn't matter. Or you could be someone who's made a great sacrifice for this country. I would say probably like the Gurkhas. I fully support the Gurkhas who've gone out and risked their lives for this country being granted British citizenship because I believe they've earned it, and without the right to vote. But I don't recognise the right of people who haven't had that sacrifice and haven't been raised by British people, whether adopted or not, because I don't see them as part of the demos. Just like I don't think I should be able to vote in French elections. I don't think a French person should be able to come here and vote in our elections. One of the reasons I oppose the EU. Why should my vote? I see it as essentially you've talked about colonialism.
There's a very basic, hallowed principle: no taxation without representation. The most basic tenet of democracy. A government can't tax someone if they have no right in choosing the government. So you can set on one side issues of nationality and just look at it as a matter of human rights. That if you're going to have a ruler, then you have a right to choose the ruler.
Only if it's your country. For example, if I went over to Spain and I started living and working in Spain, I would have no right to vote. And I shouldn't have a right to vote because I'm there as a guest. Now, if I move, if I get citizenship of Spain, right? And, I tutor history. I know a little bit about the history of Spain, but I've not lived there. I've not been raised with Spanish people. I don't really know their culture.
Your definition very ungenerous. I think we should be more generous in our acceptance of other non-white communities. I find it a bit distasteful.
It's not about race
to think
at all.
that British people are only people of white British descent or who've been adopted or
but it doesn't.
Backstairs route to white Britishness. We should be more generous, surely.
I don't see it as ungenerous to simply say that you have to be part of our tribe in order to vote in our tribe's elections. And that's not, and otherwise you talked about colonialism. I see I see us being colonized in a way. And I'm fine with certain people coming over here as guests if they're going to behave, right? That's all okay. There are people who come and they contribute to this country. That's fine. And there are people who come over and they integrate. Like they'll come over and they'll marry a British person.
But I mean, we are a mongrel race. Like most
I don't-
countries, Japan a possible exception, but most countries are peopled by mongrel races.
I don't care. Couldn't care less about race. I mean, I'm mixed race myself. It's not about race. It's about the culture that's passed down. For example, right? My father was from the West Indies. I've never met the bloke. So people say, "Oh, you're from the West Indies." I go, "No, I'm not from the West Indies because I've never been raised within the culture." And I would consider, if I were to go over to the West Indies and vote in the elections of one of the islands out there, I would see that as a complete invasion, because you've got this British guy who has nothing to do with the culture, right? Has not been raised by anyone or in any way part of this culture, who would then be coming over and imposing on their elections.
Yeah.
That to me is colonialism. That to me is a complete imposition. And I would consider that to be wrong. And it's not about, I couldn't care whether someone is 0% white or 100% white. I couldn't care less. What I care about is that cultural legacy. And I don't care how it comes through. If people go around adopting a bunch of, black, brown, yellow people, I wouldn't really care. What I care about is that culture being passed on. And unless that culture is being passed on, then you've got the end of the concept of the nation state.
Well, you get into questions of defining what that culture is, and I would have difficulty accepting that it was just the Magna Carta and those.
Oh, there's plenty more, which is why I don't think having an official prescription of these are our set of values and you must follow these values, apart from saying that people have fundamental rights. I would say that because that's what we need to actually function as a country. But rather than saying, oh, if you come over here, you have to follow this and follow that and you have to think like this. It's like, no, I'd rather allow it to be natural. I'd rather leave it down to the families. Like you talk about being cultural conservative, leave it down to the families to pass down what they think is valuable and have a natural evolution of culture rather than people who haven't joined into that. And I would like to see more people who come over and who are migrants actually marry British people rather than the segregation where you see migrants marry other migrants, usually from exactly the same backgrounds, and segregate. Because I don't want to live in a segregated country. I want to live in a country where we are all part of one nation and we all recognise that we come from the same root.
Well, I welcome integration, but I don't think we should be afraid of what you call segregation. If people continue to intermarry with other people of their similar background, we shouldn't be afraid of that. I think it enriches our overall culture. Brazil used to have this issue, and they called themselves the salad bowl of cultures. So the blacks and the Indians and the Portuguese whites stayed fairly separate, but they each appreciated and cultivated their own culture, and that was Brazil. We should be more like that, I think. A salad bowl of cultures.
I think I'm happy with that in terms of England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, but I'm not persuaded in terms of anything more, I'm afraid. But anyway, it's probably time for us to wrap up. So the last thing I will ask you, and this is probably quite a difficult question, I've left it till last. We've seen George Galloway do fantastic things, fighting against the war in Iraq. We've seen him standing up for Julian Assange, right? We've seen him on a number of causes fighting back against the system. He's an outsider. But the question that a lot of people are asking is, where was he during the lockdowns? Why wasn't he out against the lockdowns as someone who's meant to be skeptical of all that's going on, skeptical of the mainstream position?
You said it was a difficult question, so I thought you were going to ask me, if George Galloway was a pop star, who would he be? But I would immediately answer Ian Dury, of course, because both are aggressively working class, both are rebels, and both have a sense of humour.
And
George doesn't make fantastic music, but he makes fantastic politics. So does that answer the question you didn't ask?
That does actually answer the question I didn't ask, because I know you are a massive Blockheads fan, and I know that you're going down tonight to see the Blockheads.
Exactly.
And do you know what? I should have included that before. Right. The question that I did ask though, where was George on the lockdowns, and how can people trust that he won't make the same mistake again of not coming out and not being there?
I think George was rather late in getting it on lockdown, but he did come through towards the end. He thought that in the second year the lockdowns went on far too long, and he's always been strongly against big pharma, PHARMA, against the billionaire businesses who were making money out of lockdowns and vaccinations and all the rest, testing equipment and all the rest. So he came in, but late in the day.
But next time, is he going to be caught napping? How can we trust that he's not going to be caught napping next time?
Because I'm there.
I do like you, and I do trust you on this, Peter. So I hope that you are going to stay there.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Please give us a like, a share, a subscribe, hit the notification button if you would like to help. We've got a Patreon and a Subscribe Star, so please head on over there and pledge us some support if you want to keep this journalism going. We've got a professional studio here, and we could do with your support to keep these great conversations coming.